The mirror aging effect. Nighttime Los Angeles breathed warmth and weariness. Outside the plastic surgery clinic, neon lights fractured in puddles of asphalt, and the sterile windows reflected the highway's glow as if the street itself were peering inside. Dr. Victoria Monroe removed her surgical gloves and dropped them into the biohazard bin. The room was bathed in soft white light, no shadows, no blemishes, only smooth panels, chrome instruments, and the faint hum of ventilation, as if the entire space were holding its breath. "Everything went perfectly," she said, looking at the patient who hadn't yet regained consciousness. On the table lay an actress. Her face, wrapped in bandages, resembled a statue. Everyone knew her. Billboards, TV shows, late-night interviews. But in recent months, people had stopped recognizing her. Time never asked for permission. Half an hour later, the woman stirred. She smiled faintly, lips barely moving, and asked for a mirror. Victoria handed it to her silently. A rectangular mirror in a slim metal frame. It was old, one of those left from the pre-war era, back when the building belonged to Grace Ensley, a 1940s actress with a tragic biography. Rumor had it she had ordered mirrors directly from Italy, from a workshop the old newspapers called the place where glass remembers desire, or a curse, if one believed the housemaids. The patient slowly removed her bandages, holding her breath, and looked at herself. At first she frowned, as if not understanding what she saw. Then her eyes widened. She propped herself up on her elbows, trying to get closer to the reflection. "This is impossible," she whispered. In the mirror stared a woman in her 30s. No signs of fatigue, no under-eye wrinkles, firm cheeks, clear eyes. Youth Victoria could have promised, but not guaranteed. Victoria saw it too. For a second, her heart skipped. What she had done was masterful. But not that masterful. The patient couldn't look away. It seemed she no longer saw her real body, only what was on the other side of the glass. And then, on an instinctive level, Victoria caught something strange. The reflection blinked. Out of sync. Victoria woke before her alarm. Outside, the sky had yet to brighten with dawn, but she was already standing in front of the bedroom mirror, examining her face without makeup. Sharp cheekbones, smooth skin, a trace of fatigue under her eyes, everything was in place. Everything was hers. No miracles. And yet her gaze lingered. A shadow at the corner of her lips, a fine line on her temple that hadn't been there yesterday. In the voice of her thoughts, an old whisper. Here it begins. Her mother had always feared aging. Not illness, not loneliness, aging itself, as the loss of the right to be seen. She smeared her skin with creams, dyed her hair until the day she died, but never allowed herself to grow old with dignity. Victoria had scorned that in her youth, and now she washed her face with the same careful hands, as though her skin might crack at a sudden touch. Her clinic had always seemed more than a business. It was her way of being needed. In a world where youth was currency, she was a bank. But the miracle, or something very much like it, hadn't left her since that night. She tried to blame the anesthesia, the patient's emotional overload, the shock of first impressions. But the image of the unsynchronized blink wouldn't let go. She'd seen it, and it had no right to exist. At the clinic, the day began as usual. Sugarless coffee, rounds, a review of the surgery schedule. But beneath the routine pulsed a quiet tension, as though everything moved correctly, but according to someone else's script. On her tablet screen, before and after photos of the actress, the result was good. Excellent even, but compared to what they had seen in the mirror, something didn't add up. Too perfect, too anatomically impossible. Then a new complaint came in. A young singer who had undergone minor cheek contouring requested an emergency consultation. Her face, she claimed, was changing rapidly, yet she didn't ask to reverse the procedure. On the contrary, she insisted on mirrors in every private room to observe the process. She looked tired but radiant, almost in love. "I'm becoming myself," she told Victoria in her office, "only when I look at myself in there." Victoria said nothing, but after the appointment, she stepped into the hallway and approached the mirror on the wall. Her reflection was hers and not. Something in the posture, in the shadow of the gaze, in the slight tilt of her head felt synchronized but not natural. She stood still, listening inwardly. And for the first time in her life, she felt she could no longer trust the mirror. Victoria's clinic was known for its confidentiality. No one asked unnecessary questions, especially if the patient paid in cash and arrived after hours. Privacy was more valuable than medicine. That night he arrived. Jonathan Carroll, 60 years old, a magnate with 3 ex-wives, 2 strokes, and not a single close-up photo in the past 5 years. He was accompanied by bodyguards and a personal doctor, but he entered the consultation room alone. He spoke calmly, clearly, with a faint rasp. He asked for minor eyelid work, a neck lift, and for the mirror to show me the face I used to trust. The surgery went smoothly, but from the moment he awoke, something strange began. By the 3rd day, Jonathan refused to leave the room. He demanded the mirror above the sink remain in place, and a day later asked for another to be installed across from the bed. Meals were brought in, but he barely touched them. He spent hours in the chair, staring into the reflection, and, it seemed, speaking to someone. "That's me, the way I was," he murmured when Victoria cautiously tried to engage him. "He's the real one. I'm just the carrier." He began calling the reflection by name, Jack. Sometimes he nodded to it. Sometimes he waited for replies. He developed a habit of glancing at the mirror before speaking to anyone else, as if awaiting approval. Victoria observed him silently. He was speaking to the mirror as if it could forgive him. "I've waited for things from mirrors too, but what exactly? Permission? Reassurance? A promise that I'm not lost just yet?" A week later, she noticed he had drastically deteriorated. His skin, grayer. His movements slower. Blood work was fine, but his overall state was alarming. And yet, in the mirror, he looked better than he had on the day after surgery. Younger, stronger, more certain. When Victoria attempted to dim the lights in the room, he screamed, not like a grown man, like a child. "Don't take me away from there. He's all I have. He is me. Without him, I'm nothing." After that, she ordered all mirrors removed from the general areas. And that night, she caught herself standing in her bathroom. And slowly, very slowly, smiling at her reflection. And for the first time, she didn't know who had smiled first. Victoria had never believed in mysticism. Medicine had no place for mystery, only for statistics, biology, and a hand steady in micro-movements. But what was happening to her patients slipped past all clinical explanation. She began collecting data, compared post-op photos with how the patients looked in mirrors, secretly photographing them at the same angle under identical lighting. The discrepancies were minimal, almost imperceptible, but they were there. The jawline slightly higher, the eye color brighter, wrinkles appearing lifted. Each day, the gap grew more noticeable. And then she ran an experiment. In one patient room, she replaced the mirror with a new one bought from a nearby store. A modern model with a protective coating and no amalgam backing. The patient, an aging TV host, reacted instantly. "That's not me. Where's my face?" and demanded the real mirror be returned. When Victoria refused, the woman cried, not from pain, but from loss. In another room, she brought in an antique mirror from the storage closet. tarnished, slightly warped, a piece that had come with the building decades ago. A businessman in his 50s stood before it, stared silently for a long time, then said, "It knows me better than I do." Victoria examined the materials. Silver, amalgam, glass riddled with microfractures and tiny specks, typical of mirrors manufactured before 1950. They didn't make them like that anymore. Modern ones were inert. They reflected but didn't respond. She pulled the building's old architectural plans. Adjacent to one of the rooms where the effect was strongest, there used to be Madame Ensley's salon, a private space belonging to the building's former owner. A legendary actress from the 1940s whose face glowed on black and white photographs. On the plans, separate ventilation, reinforced thermal insulation, mirror wall. She had spent hours in there. Victoria returned to the mirrors. A hypothesis was forming. Perhaps antique mirrors weren't just surfaces, but memory. Not glass, but vessels. They didn't reflect, they remembered, and gave back not one's appearance, but the image fixed in a moment of deepest desire. Desire to be oneself, or someone else entirely. She combed through the archives. Almost all the clinic's mirrors were original, pre-war, a unique feature of the building she had never questioned. And for the first time in years, she opened a medical textbook, not on anatomy, but psychiatry. The article was titled Narcissistic Differentiation, a clinical case of mirror transference. But there were no answers inside, only a familiar word: split. He died without a sound. A man in his 40s, one of the quiet clients. Those who didn't ask, didn't complain, just paid and vanished. He came in for a mid-facelift, a standard, uncomplicated procedure. 3 days after discharge, cardiac arrest. No warning signs, no abnormalities in his labs. They found his body in his penthouse, his face pale with a faint smile. Next to him, a full-length mirror, covered in handprints. On the floor, a note: "He's happy, I'm not." Victoria watched footage from the home camera provided by the family for the investigation. The final minutes, the man sits facing the mirror, barely moving. Then suddenly leans forward, as if toward a springtime window. His reflection, alive, youthful, calm. When the body slumps to the floor, the reflection remains, upright, steady, eyes bright. The coroner listed natural causes. Victoria did not. She returned to the clinic and went to the storage vault. Behind a coated door stood the mirrors she had had removed in recent weeks. All of them old, flawed, their frames still bearing the prints of hands, as if someone had clung to their edges. She ran her finger over one. The surface cold, too cold. Instinctively, she brought her face closer, and again saw the mismatch. Fresher skin, clearer eyes. As though the mirror showed potential, not reality, or stole reality in exchange for illusion. In the reflection, something flickered, the subtlest of gestures, not hers. And in that moment, Victoria remembered. When she was 16, standing in the school bathroom, holding her sister's lipstick and crying over a boy's insult. "Do you put on lipstick to distract from your nose?" he'd said, then walked away without looking back. She had stood in front of the dull mirror, trying to erase the girl just rejected. Since then, she had always returned to mirrors, as judge, as weapon, as escape. Now, it looked back at her, but with the right to ask questions. Victoria picked up a hammer, approached one of the mirrors, raised it, but did not strike. In the reflection stood herself, and not herself, the version with different choices, a different life, a different gaze. Her hand trembled. If she shattered it, she'd lose the chance to see that version again. If she didn't, others would vanish. The price of beauty had become too personal. The mirrors in room 17 were rearranged. Angled walls, a corridor of reflections. Patients said it helped them see from all sides. But no one noticed when the woman in bed 17B stopped speaking. She was a former ballerina, age 71. Elegant, erect posture, as if her spine still remembered the bar. She had undergone a minor facial correction, yet now sat motionless, peering into the triple reflection of her seated figure. Once, she had been invited to tour in Paris, the dream of her youth, but a fractured ankle closed that door forever. Now, only rehearsals remained, with her reflection. In it, she still danced, still leaped, still flew. Victoria entered silently and observed her. The woman barely blinked. Occasionally, she would lift her hand as if reaching for a partner, then lower it slowly. Outside the room, a nurse whispered, "She hasn't eaten in 2 days, says she's afraid to turn away." Victoria replaced one of the mirrors with a blank panel. That night, the ballerina screamed until her voice gave out. In the neighboring room, a man said his mirror had turned away. "It used to smile at me," he said. "Now it looks disappointed." Another patient complained that his reflection was always a step behind. "It lags," he muttered. "I move, but it waits, like it doesn't want to follow." The mirrors were beginning to resist. Victoria documented each report. A pattern emerged. The longer a patient stared, the more autonomous the reflection became. Not oppositional yet, but selective. It began to choose what to reflect, what to amplify, what to suppress. Late at night, she walked through the empty corridor. In every polished surface, herself, but slightly altered. In one, younger. In another, harsher. In a third, weeping. And in one terrifying frame, no reflection at all. Just empty glass. That night, a nurse reported a disappearance. Patient 12D, the actor, was gone. No signs of escape, no traces. But his reflection appeared that same morning, in room 9, in someone else's mirror. Victoria placed the old mirror in the center of the hall. Around it, the others she had removed, in a circle, like an audience. She stood in the middle with the hammer in her hand, alone. Her heart beat loudly like it hadn't in years. They watched her. Dozens of versions of her, older, younger, disheveled, perfect. Each reflected image stood slightly differently, none synchronized. Some smiled, some were blank. One turned away. She raised the hammer. And then they shifted. The reflections didn't mimic her movement. They moved independently. Some reached toward her, others backed away. One lifted its own hammer. Then the whispers began. You could be young again. You could be needed. You could be adored. You could be loved. One image showed her as a child, sitting on the floor, crying over broken glasses. Her mother kneeling beside her, stroking her hair. Another, her teenage self wiping off makeup in shame. Another, her now dead sister whispering, "You're still beautiful, you know." And one, her own child, whom she never had. She lowered the hammer, just for a second, but then she gripped it tighter. They weren't memories, they were temptations. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and smashed the first mirror. A crack, then another, shards spilled like water. Screams, hers, theirs, rippled through the room. She struck again, and again, and again. With each blow, the reflections blurred, then darkened, then faded. When she reached the last mirror, the original one from Madame Ensley's salon, she paused. Her reflection still stood there, calm, human, honest. It didn't beg, didn't lie, didn't promise anything. She whispered, enough, and shattered it. The clinic was quiet now. The mirrors had been removed, the walls repainted, the rooms depersonalized. It had become an ordinary facility. CT scans, ultrasounds, dermatology. Not a single reflective surface in sight. Victoria sat alone in the waiting area where patients once admired themselves in a massive polished glass. Resting on her lap was a box containing the last artifact, a fragment of the old mirror, the very same. A faint silver crack ran along the edge like a vein of memory. She held it in her hands like something fragile and unfinished, hesitating. Eventually, she looked. The reflection was ordinary. No silent seduction, no illusion of youth, no flicker of dread. A woman in her middle years, tired, with silver beginning to show at her temples and a deep crease across her brow. But her gaze was clear. She smiled, not at the reflection, but at herself, for the first time in years, without judgment. From the open window, a breeze moved through the room. It rustled the pamphlets on the bulletin board, lifted the curtain slightly, and brought with it the scent of spring. Not rejuvenation, not some unreachable promise, just spring, honest and alive. Victoria stood. Carefully, almost reverently, she placed the fragment back into the box, closed it, and stored it in a cabinet on the highest shelf. She was no longer afraid to see herself. Sometimes, a reflection is not a threat, not a judge, not an illusion. Sometimes, it's just a witness.